Now we'll hear from Anthony LILTI from North Carolina State University, whose works include Inter alia, a book on grace, talent, and merit, and another on Fichte, the self and the calling of philosophy, and whose current project, Manly Thoughts, the Labor of the Mind, and the Spectre of Effeminacy in Enlightenment Culture, addresses notions of genius.
Thank you all for coming. I mean, really, thank you all for coming. I had visions of the five of us in the lack of an audience repairing to a cafe and conducting a virtual seminar. This is a mob. It's fantastic. Thank you very much. You'll see that my paper connects quite closely, unusually closely, I think, with Darrin's. I hadn't seen Darrin's paper when I wrote it, but I knew of his work. So this is a somewhat unusual pairing, I think, as these sorts of presentations go. So, I've had an impulse to cry, all hands on deck. Is it not self-evident that if intellectual history is to avoid being one of the discipline's fluffiest lightweights, it must be thoroughly, even doggedly contextual? And yet there is a movement afoot that dares to question the unquestionable. To be fair to the upstarts, they are not calling for a return to what has been dismissed as the hopelessly idealist and worse, highbrow history of ideas with which, fairly or not, Arthur Lovejoy is said to have burdened American scholarship. Can you hear me? Okay. Yeah, okay. Burdened American scholarship. But they are calling for what my co-panelist Darrin McMahon terms a, quote, refashioned history of ideas. Darrin has in mind a history not premised on any sort of idealist metaphysics, and certainly not limited to a sacred canon, but exploring filiations and ruptures in ideas over much wider temporal stretches than we find in most current scholarship, and accessing them in ways that allow us to engage them for present purposes, perhaps even to evaluate their truth claims. Darrin, Peter Gordon, and others argue that studies over the longue durée are needed as a counterpoint to a stifling contextualist consensus that risks ending in historiographical provincialism or pointillism. An admirable example of a history of ideas on this scale is Darrin's own recent book, Divine Fury, A History of Genius, which traces ideas of genius from antiquity to the 20th century. The book's erudition, the suppleness of its arguments, and the agility of its prose make it a tour de force in a refashioned history of ideas. Its chapter on the Enlightenment, the one I will focus on here, includes a discussion of Denis Diderot as, quote, one of the most penetrating and eloquent analysts, end quote, of the ascendant concept of original genius. The genius born, not made, miraculously gifted by nature, with a virtually superhuman powers of imagination, his creations formed in a spontaneous transport, a kind of enthusiasm akin to transcendent inspiration. Darrin provides abundant evidence for this apotheosis of genius from a variety of Diderot's texts. And so I confess to feeling somewhat peevish about using Darrin's chapter here as a foil to my own work on Diderot and genius, but I will do it. I will be peevish in the hope of occasioning, this is productive peevishness, in the hope of occasioning fruitful discussion. I agree with much of what Darrin and others have had to say about method and scale in intellectual history. The appeal to context has become suspiciously routine. Simply by using the word, we seem to exempt ourselves from having to justify the choice of some contexts over others in recovering the meaning of texts. And there is such a thing as hypercontextualism, a form of reductionism that has the effect of precluding cross-temporal engagement with the truth claims of ideas as such. Nor am I objecting here to one of Darrin's two arguments, that the 18th century purchase of the idea of genius lay in the fact that with, quote, the unprecedented clearing of the heavens, of mediating powers, and the attendant withdrawal of God, end quote, there was a felt need for, quote, a new figure to provide a portion of God's power and an element of guardian comfort. I like that phrase, guardian comfort, very much. In fact, I find that the fine balance of his approach, his argument that the concept of the mysteriously inspired and virtually omnipotent genius was something quite new and modern, and yet had pronounced structural and semantic affinities with the old, effectively avoids the pitfalls of the term, the awful term, secularization, a term he wisely avoids. The difference in my approach starts with Darrin's other argument, that the concept of genius was also a needed counterpoint to the gathering force of, quote, the broad assertion of human equality, of opportunity, of rights, of general endowment, end quote. I claim no originality for my own approach, which I will call a rhetorical variant on contextualism. The logic of it is simple. If I take text to be rhetorical performances in the broadest sense of the word rhetorical, I have to read them as situated in various directions. Some of these are immediate. The logic of situatedness takes us into, for example, the author's biographical circumstances, her passage through webs of social relationships, the field of argument she's addressing. But of course, if we pay close hermeneutic attention to a text's rhetorical properties, sorry, I lost myself here. Its figurative language, its tropes, its uses of conventions of genre, its changes of voice, and so on. We reach deep into its layered meanings. We might call this, and I'm sorry for this, this is one of those spatial metaphors that make you cringe. We might call this the vertical route to horizontal extension. It's even worse when you say it out loud. We're led out to the long durée of discourses embedded in the text, or at least to the middle durée. That's why I'm reluctant to draw a line between a refashioned history of ideas and what I'm doing. That Diderot engaged the Stoic tradition throughout his life, often obliquely, or that he figured women's sexuality as a force of raw nature threatening chaos, is no less relevant than that he was anxiously trying to arrange a marriage for his daughter from 1767 to 1772, or that he was fascinated with a new medical theory that became fashionable in Paris in the 1750s and 1760s. An author's rhetorical performance mediates between his subjectivity, which is, I think, largely inaccessible, and his presence on the page, which I think is only apparently straightforward. In Diderot's text, the mediation is particularly complicated. If his corpus presents us with contradictions on the subject of genius, that is because genius was a focal point for an interior quarrel, a quarrel within himself that was ongoing and seemingly irresolvable. What is remarkable is his ability to record with unflinching scrutiny the centripetal pulls in the processes of his own creativity. He kept feeling the pulse of his own subjectivity, where he found two conflicting impulses to self-presentation, now denying each other's moral legitimacy, now trying to come to terms. On one side of his interior quarrel, Diderot is the man of feeling in the culture of sensibilité, expressing his own emotions with the freedom of spontaneous self-exhibition. In the higher order of this kind of emotion-soaked spontaneity, the creative act, the act of genius, was a kind of ecstasy or transport, akin to inspiration. The other Diderot was a man of detached and impersonal reason, the impartial spectator observing the action on stage. Genius in this key was self-controlled, calm, cold, detached, cold in its powers of judgment. Rhetorically, this dualism was performed in distinct voices, often contesting each other or approaching conciliation in the same text. Two implications are worth noting at this point. The first is that it is tricky to use Diderot at the level of a history of ideas. And the second is that it's entirely possible that Darrin and I are both right, or at least half right. To me, the most intriguing of Diderot's texts on genius is titled On Genius. It is a brief piece he wrote sometime after 1757 and did not publish. It is a kind of meditation by a third voice. Flatly rejecting both sides of his internal quarrel, Diderot dismisses the powers attributed to original genius, as well as the counter-image of the genius, made, not born, developing his natural talent with disciplined labor. Most of the text is an inventory of what genius is not. Genius is not, quote, imagination, end quote, which produces little or nothing. That is a startling repudiation of the usual rhetoric about original genius, including his own. And yet genius is also not, at the other end of the cognitive spectrum, judgment, which often produces things that are slack, limp, and cold. Nor does genius lie in, quote, taste, end quote, which is socially acquired, not a, quote, force of nature. Or in esprit, which says only pretty and small things. Or in heat or enthusiasm. Which is often, enthusiasm being often self-deluding. Genius certainly is not sensibility, which pulls people out of themselves into a drunken or mad state and makes them, quote, stammer like children without whether they are writing or speaking. That's another startling repudiation. What then is genius? Quote, a certain conformation of the head and the viscera, a certain constitution of the humors, and no less important, l'esprit observateur, which is something utterly different from, quote, that petty daily espionage of words, actions, and looks, that tact so familiar to women, to a degree superior to the strongest heads, to the greatest souls, to the most vigorous geniuses. The spirit of the observateur, again, quote, is exercised without effort, without contention. It does not examine, it sees, it instructs itself, it extends itself without studying. It is a kind of sixth sense that others do not have. For Diderot, the specter of equality lay above all in mass conformism, the flattening of individuated character, so stifling as to have no place for original genius, and indeed for any individual creativity. As Darrin lucidly shows from Diderot's extended critique in 1773 of Helvetius's of Man, Diderot believed in the organic singularity of every human being. And so he tried to demolish Helvetius' logic that at birth natural differences in intelligence were negligible, and hence that it was education that largely determined who would rise to intellectual heights, even to the stratosphere of genius. Helvetius's environmentalism, Diderot objected, was a threat to human freedom. It would produce people denatured by society and its institutions. But Diderot's thinking about genius was also an outlet for his profound alienation from the state of inequality, the reality of steep social hierarchy in Haute France. Here I am indebted to Jerry Siegel's reading of Diderot's famous comment that in France men are like coins, whose imprint is worn down by constant circulation. With the mixing of people of different stations in so many urban spaces, every station became obsessed with emulating the station above it, with the result that people's natural characters as individuals were effaced. From this angle, the threat to original genius was not a looming state of equality, but a hierarchy of emulation. People conforming to the reigning distinctions of social honor, confirming boundaries of distinction in the very ambition to cross them. This is what exasperated Diderot about his son-in-law, from a prosperous merchant family in his hometown. And this correspondence I recommend, it's really quite extraordinary. The young fool, as he called him, was turning his daughter into a risible bourgeois imitation of an aristocratic grande dame. obsessed with fashion and so busy making the social round that she had no time to retreat into herself, to be herself. What matters from this angle is not any philosophical or political claim to equality of rights, but a specific social configuration with which Diderot had a very vexed relationship. The claims made for the cultural authority of the genius by Diderot and others took aim at the pinnacle of the hierarchy, le monde, the Parisian high society in which, as Antoine LILTI has shown, the aristocracy still set the standards for polite manners and taste. On genius, its presence is evoked with a family of words: taste, esprit, tact, and perhaps surprisingly, sensibilité. To Diderot, as to many of his contemporaries, the genius was the antithesis of the man of letters as an honnête homme, a polite gentleman, and above all as a virtuoso bel esprit, the honnête homme of the highest order, the embodiment and arbiter of polite taste. Since the mid-17th century, these types had personified what I am calling a social aesthetic of play, which still held sway in mondain circles. This was a relentlessly performative culture, paradoxical in that it banned any appearance of labor in performance, whether in preparation or in the performance itself. One of its code words was aisance, or effortlessness, which made taboo even the appearance of concentrated and sustained intellectual labor in conversation and in polite writing style. Faced with what he considered the triviality of this standard of taste, Diderot insisted that genius was a force of nature, not a hothouse verbal facility acquired in polite sociability. But he juggled two notions of this natural force. On the one hand, that it took the form of a spontaneous creation, perhaps even an enthusiastic transport, and on the other, that it was channeled into relentlessly self-disciplined effort that transformed natural gifts into prodigious feats of labor. In the latter case, the labor of genius required a highly self-conscious withdrawal into solitude, the antithesis of the symbiosis between conversation and writing in polite society. Only by withdrawing into labor could the genius escape contamination by the trivializing conventions of polite taste. In the expanding culture of print, that made for an interesting paradox. Solitude, one might say, was the condition for the genius's societal mission. Only a print rhetoric forged in solitary labor, removed from social representations and unmediated by them, could galvanize a society into a civic community. In the 18th century, Darrin rightly notes genius was largely a male prerogative. I have found that for Diderot, this gendering of genius was not an unreflective assumption, that it faced him with dilemmas he may never have fully resolved. When in On Genius he dismissed the imagination as sterile, it was partly with women in mind. That in female cognition, the imagination played the dominant role was a truism of gender discourse. Diderot blamed it for two abuses of language that were peculiar, if not unique, to women. He pitted male genius against what he regarded as the triviality of women's social intelligence, their, quote, daily petty espionage of words, actions, and looks, and against their, quote, tact, by which he meant above all the mondain code of complaisance. Here we have women in control, using their imaginative grasp of psychological detail to scheme, dissemble, manipulate. In Diderot's Sous les femmes, written in 1772, women's imagination is out of control, though it has its cunning in the pursuit of power. It is the polar opposite of disciplined labor, imagination run amok, the plaything of the tyrannical sexual energy of the uterus, its emblematic form being religious hysteria. Though Diderot never definitively resolved his interior quarrel, there was a marked shift in emphasis, as Carol Bloom's classic Diderot, the Virtue of a Philosopher has demonstrated, from the early 1750s to the late 1760s, already underway in the On Genius fragment, but far from complete. The young Diderot extolled genius in the febrile rhetoric of the literary culture of sensibility. Taking Shaftesbury as his example in the Encyclopédie article in 1755, he declared genius to be, quote, a pure gift of nature, end quote, an overpowering force of imagination which animates thought with sentiment, with an excess of desire, with a heat of enthusiasm. In the ensuing years, Diderot grew skeptical of sensibility as it was absorbed into the mondaine culture of performance and became fake self-exhibition, a new phase in the mondaine affectation of the natural and the spontaneous. His disillusionment went hand in hand with an inclination to a modified Stoicism. He never fully embraced Stoicism. Rational self-command through ascesis seemed to him unnatural and hence unattainable. But already in the early 50s, he had a deep admiration for the true Stoic sage. By the late 1760s, Diderot seems to be entrenching himself at this neo-Stoic end of his interior quarrel. In the character of Bourdieu, in The Dream of d'Alembert, he playfully caricatures the real Théophile Bourdieu, a prominent physician in Paris with whom he was well acquainted, but nonetheless makes him the voice of scientific authority. The great man Bourdieu observes, if he has unfortunately received this natural tendency toward sensibility, he will constantly attempt to weaken it, to dominate it, to make himself the master of his movements, and to leave all powers in the brain. In this way, Bourdieu continued, he will judge coldly but sanely. People with sensitivity or fools are on the stage, he is in the orchestra, he is the sage. Increasingly, he equated sensibility with female weakness and lack of self-control. Sensibility is never without weakness or organization, he wrote in The Paradox of the Actor. The tear which escapes a man who is truly male touches us more than the crying of a woman. As Diderot swung away from the genius of sensibility, he had this specter of female weakness, of effeminacy, clearly in mind. I'm in trouble here now. How much time do I have?
Well, to make you fair with Darrin, I think we're 2 minutes.
2 minutes.
But it's
Okay, well.
We'll be peevish down at your
All right, I'll try 2 minutes. See it?
that'll be 25 minutes.
Okay. Coming at Diderot's thinking from these directions, we can understand a crucial turn in his fascination with medicine. Bourdieu, the real Bourdieu, was the chief spokesperson in Paris for the Montpellier School of Medicine, which was now called Vitalist Materialism. The Vitalists sought to dismantle the mechanistic paradigm with the key concepts of sensibility and irritability. Each organ had its own irreducible force, activated but not transmitted by irritation, and the vitally enervated organ was in that sense self-acting. Well, I think I'm just going to summarize from here. What happened as Diderot becomes increasingly fascinated with Bourdieu, I think, is that he does something interesting. He finds a way of splitting the faculty of the imagination into a male faculty and a female faculty. And the male faculty is a labor of the imagination. The female faculty is increasingly imagination run amok, utterly without discipline and without the capacity for labor. And this, I think, is one of the most interesting things about Diderot's concepts of genius. Now, what does this tell us about a refashioned history of ideas and my rhetorical variant on contextualism? Probably not much, but I would say first that if you read texts rhetorically, as I was trying to do, the dichotomy between the two approaches is not at all as strong as it might at first appear to be. And that is because when you read texts rhetorically, again, you reach down into lower levels of meaning, and these extend you out, not perhaps into the longue durée, but at least into the middle durée. To just give two examples, you can't understand Diderot's notion of vitalist materialism in medicine unless you understand the much longer tradition of monist materialism that long preceded Spinoza and that Diderot is well aware of. Perhaps more striking, on the issue of gender, Diderot was in one way utterly conventional. He said what everyone had been saying was saying about what the differences between men and women were. To the degree that he was original, it was in trying to explain why the differences were there by means of a new medical paradigm. So, again, to think of this in terms of the Langue de Day, Diderot, you cannot understand Diderot's text sur les femmes, for example, without remembering that it echoes more than a millennium of gender discourse. That's about as far as I can go. It's totally irresponsible. I leave it to us to then discuss what the relationship between Darrin and I actually is. Thank you.